When coming into South Africa, I had been labelled a communist.
Should I ask the question, did you ever experiment?
Well, once or twice.
Okay.
Once or twice.
So do you think that Trump will be detrimental to women's rights in America?
I do. Yes, I do. I think not only women's, but a lot of other people's rights too. They woke us up at 4 and made us dig what looked like graves. And we weren't quite sure whether we were going to be the ones that were going into them. I'll tell you one thing, which probably I will be in prison for, and that is...
But this is a war-torn country.
It was just to be able to speak to the people about it. Try a cave next time.
No, I don't. Coming up with an introduction for today's guest has been incredibly difficult. I like to consider myself well-travelled, but I cannot compete with Anne Centner. So in order to make today's introduction as short as possible, I've just come up with a few key phrases and key words, like clandestine publisher. How about women's liberation movement? We have lived in a cave in Greece. Kibbutz. How about a pseudo-meteorologist? An Indian man bus trip, Kabul, Vietnam, teaching in Argentina, extreme marathon, and world record. Please join me in welcoming Anne Centner. You were involved in the women's liberation movement back in the 1960s. I was born in the 1970s, so I had to do a bit of the googly to find out exactly what it's all about. And I came up with, I think, some key ideas. Evidently, it was the second wave of feminism. Apart from that, you concentrated on social and cultural issues and changes, as well as traditional gender roles and addressing issues of reproductive rights. Does that sum it up?
It does, except that you've missed one thing, which was the burning of the bra. That was very important to make a statement of feminism. It was quite a small group of people who were doing it, and it appealed to me that we should have more rights than we have at the moment. So I joined this group, and we published pamphlets, and we distributed them to all around, mainly the north of London. And that's where our protests began.
Just explain exactly what burning the bra is.
Just discarding something that illustrates feminism.
Okay.
And it happened to be that part of clothing that we thought would make a statement.
This might sound like a ridiculous question, but did you burn your own bra, or did you go out and buy a second bra and still carry on wearing your own bra?
No, one just burnt the bra that you had on, and then that's how you lived your life, without a bra. That was a statement that you were making.
How did you get involved in that?
I think I just left school, and I was in a quandary as to what to do, a bit of a rebel. And this just piqued my interest, and thought, well, why don't I try and join this group and see whether we can make a difference to feminism. Several protests, and I think this is why later on, when coming into South Africa, I had been labelled a communist for being at these protests. So when I wanted to stay in South Africa, I was not allowed to. I was allowed to stay here for, I think it was 3 months, and then when I wanted to renew it, they said, we're very sorry. So I asked them a question, why? Give me a reason why. And the gentleman said, we do not have to give you any reason. You just have to get out of the country.
So how is communism linked to women's rights?
I would like to ask the government that very question. But I think any protest was obviously labelled as being a rebel, whether it was a communist or just someone who was not wanted in another country that could actually make trouble for them.
So in a way, it was easier for them just to paint it all with one brush and justify that to people, that the propaganda that had been spread at the time is red and communism are the big enemy. And so anybody linked to any kind of disturbance is a communist.
You fell under that umbrella. Yes, quite right.
How long were you part of that movement?
Probably for about a year.
Clandestine publications. Just explain to me exactly what that is. It sounds very 007.
The pamphlets that we were publishing, we had to do it in someone's house, the rolling of the printing and do all of that because it was not really legal.
And the distribution of them?
We would do street distribution, and anyone who happened to be shopping in Marks and Spencer's, we would just give them and hopefully they didn't then buy a bra from Marks and Spencer's.
That was in the 1960s. We are now in 2024. Do you believe globally it has had an impact?
I do, to such an extent that I think it has put men in a position of being quite threatened. To go to the elections in the States, I think that Trump probably got more votes because Harris was actually trying to support the women, and that was threatening. So it actually, apparently, a lot of the men went to support Trump.
So do you think that Trump will be detrimental to women's rights in America?
I do. Yes, I do. I think not only women's, but a lot of other people's rights too. I first went to Canada, where I actually was emigrated. That was the only way you could get into Canada was to emigrate. I landed in Montreal and I stayed in a very proper house for ladies, which was run by this eccentric lady who used the whip and made sure that we were in by 8 o'clock at night. But then I had to obviously look for a job, and one came up at McGill University. I was interviewed by the professor of engineering, and his first question was, "What do you know about meteorology?" And I thought to myself, if I get this job, I've got to know about meteorology. So I said, "Oh, it's my hobby. How fantastic." And he said, "Well, without going further, we have a job for you. You can be the assistant meteorological observer at McGill Observatory." The next day, or 2 days, I spent in the library finding out what meteorology was all about. When I started, I was under the chief meteorological observer, and she taught me a lot, but unfortunately, she fell sick. And it was up to me to go up onto the roof of the observatory and gauge the distance of the clouds. Now, my distance perception is nil. So it was a question of thumb sucking and going through all the cloud formations that I could possibly think of. And then I went downstairs and I had to broadcast to the Canadian nationals what it was going to be. But it was fortunate because it was winter. So I covered every single winter combination that I could. And for a week, the Canadians went through snow, sleet, a bit of sun, possible rain, and thick fog. So I think there will be something in their records that will be quite unusual I think it was 1964 that happened.
So how accurate were your predictions?
Oh, they were all thumbsucks. Except that when I looked out the window, it was snowing. So I was obviously
100% on there.
100%, yes. And then, of course, I have to think of the other side of Canada. So I just put in a little bit of sun, and hopefully somebody saw the sun at some stage across Canada. When I left, the professor of engineering gave me a letter recommending me. So I don't know. He obviously didn't look at any of the forecast records. But no, it was a wonderful experience. Montreal in itself was quite a shock to me because it was then very French. So if you spoke English, and for example, if you took the bus and you spoke English, they wouldn't answer you.
You came from the United Kingdom, which effectively, almost apart from the Channel, borders France. France is their neighbour to an extent. Yes. Did you learn French in school?
Yes, it was obligatory to learn French. So, I knew schoolgirl French, so I could get by, not as if I didn't know any French. But sometimes French-speaking people tend to know that you don't, and they will then quicken up the pace. So that it makes it more difficult for you to understand.
Were you ever found out as someone who actually has no background or knowledge of meteorology?
No, I wasn't. I had lots of records to go back onto, and I used to go up onto the roof with the observer, the chief observer, so I could take some of her knowledge there and just share it with the nation when I had to on my own.
And this was obviously all pre-satellite days.
Oh, yes. Yes, it was a thumb suck, Someone suggested going and working on a kibbutz as a volunteer. So it didn't take me very long before I was on a plane to Tel Aviv. When I got there, I had been assigned a kibbutz up in the north. And somebody put me on a bus and said, you'll be told when to get off. So we travelled up north, and then the bus driver stopped. There was nothing I could see around me, and he said, this is your stop. So I got out with my backpack, and the bus went off, and I thought, now, what direction do I go in? So I just walked and walked and walked, and eventually found a couple of buildings which were from the kibbutz. The experience in the kibbutz was quite interesting because there were a lot of volunteers who went to do work in the kibbutz. But they also, unfortunately, at that stage, were quite interested in drugs. And they obviously, the kibbutzniks didn't want any association with drugs. So we were very much separated.
Should I ask the question, did you ever experiment?
Well, once or twice.
Okay.
Once or twice, yeah. So once very badly, and other times it was very nice. Thank you very much. We weren't allowed to talk to the kids in case we corrupt their minds. And there's one story about they woke us up at 4 and made us dig what looked like graves. And we weren't quite sure whether we were going to be the ones that were going into them. And then the next morning, they woke us up and they asked us to fill the holes again. So I think they didn't really like us there. It had just been after the 6-Day War, and maybe they were just a little bit nervous.
If you were in the northern side, that's closer to Syria,
Yes.
as well as Lebanon.
Yep, absolutely.
Syria was actively involved in the 6-Day War. Were you concerned at all?
Not really. And I think that if there had been any concern, we wouldn't have been allowed to go there because there was an agency who placed you at various kibbutz. I decided with a couple of friends to go to America. I was fortunate enough that my father had a company in the States, in New York. So I worked there for, it was about 8 months. We actually were in the area where it was very creative, and there was a university there, and it was a wonderful, I think it's called Little Chelsea, is it? And we learned Spanish there because we knew that we were going into Mexico. So we learned Spanish and we worked. I forgot to tell you that just before I went to the States, I went to Switzerland to show my relatives how to ski, because I had skied before. And on the first day on the nursery slopes, I broke my leg. So I went to the States with a plaster on my leg, and it had to come off. So I had to walk because there was a taxi and a transport strike. I had to walk for about an hour and a half to a hospital to get it removed with an electric saw.
An electric saw, not the kind of apparatus that they use now, vibrating apparatus to remove the cast.
Through, and I had evidence of this because they managed to burn a whole portion of my leg with it. We bought a car, which was the thing to do in those ages. At that time, you bought a car on the east and you went to the west. So we did that, and that's where our travels to Mexico started from there.
So what car did you buy?
It was a beaten-up old station wagon, green in colour. And we actually sold it on the West Coast for a profit.
Even now, if a person thinks of the idea of travelling from New York to California, it's a massive trip of a few thousand kilometres. Back in the 1960s, we didn't have the same amount of air travel and it wasn't as affordable. Did you go with a whole load of people as support?
Yeah, I was travelling with 2 friends from school. We shared the driving. We broke down a couple of times, and it's a question of putting a stocking around the fan belt and all that sort of thing. You made a plan. And if you were lucky enough to have someone who was passing by on one of these isolated roads, then you hoped that they'd be able to help you go on. We did actually crash it once, but with a bit of creative sculpturing, we managed to put it back into some sort of shape.
And how did you come up with money to fund this?
We earned as we went along. So in San Francisco, I worked in Macy's. I worked in the Boy Scout department. And I do remember quite an embarrassing experience when Mother came and said, I want an extra large pair of Boy Scouts trousers. And I said, no, we don't have such a thing because, it would be impossible for a boy to work. Whereupon she produced her son, who was that size. So, that sort of thing you have to be. I did actually resign straight after that because I realized that I wasn't able to be of asset to Macy's.
Your public skills weren't that good at the time.
Right, that's right, yes.
Did you have to get an international driver's license, or could you just use your South African or British driver's license?
You couldn't at that point in time. You had your international driving license, which I think lasted a year or a couple of years. That did as well going down into Mexico. We went down into Mexico in this beaten up old chariot.
I thought you sold it in California.
When we came back from Mexico.
Okay,
so we used it to go into Mexico and come back again.
So you traveled across from New York to California?
That's right.
And then from California, you went down into Mexico?
That's it.
Motivation to go to Mexico?
We'd heard of an eccentric lady. She was right down south of Mexico, and she was an artist, and we'd seen some of her work. So that's one of our reasons to go. And we did. We stayed with her, and I actually have a couple of pieces of her work. We did spend time, because that is where we crashed our car. So we went and lived on an island for a while it was being repaired. Island just off Mexico. And quite a lot of the time was spent in Mexico City, because it's a fascinating city to be in. And then we returned to San Francisco and sold the car. Two of us went on from there to Vietnam during the war, just really to understand what it is to be involved in a war. These sort of things I didn't tell my parents until after I'd been there. So nobody knew that we were there, but it was a very interesting, very fleeting visit to Saigon.
I'm trying to understand your motivation. You said you just went to Vietnam. Now, us here in the Western world, to a certain extent, we get fed Western propaganda. So even now, 2024, when we think we have equal access to global information, at the end of the day, the majority of what we're seeing is still being fed to us by specific forces and powers and governments. In those days, you were in America. And what you were seeing about the Vietnam War was obviously from America's perspective. Why on earth would you think, well, I want to have a first-hand experience of what's going on?
Because you were being fed propaganda from the media. I just wanted to find out myself and be able to judge or experience what it was like to be part of the war, and hopefully to speak to some of the people that were there defending themselves. I think it was just a curiosity that I should be finding out for myself what it was like, rather than accept what I read in the papers or heard on the radio.
But this is a war-torn country.
It was just to be able to speak to the people about it, to speak to those who were not only defending themselves, but also involved in it as passive people. And that's what I wanted to know, what they felt about the war.
How many Western passive people were there?
Not very many. But the local people, the people, for example, in the hotel, in the shops, we would ask them what they felt about it. They couldn't leave, so they had to make the best of what it was like to be in a war-torn country.
They couldn't leave because financially they were tied down. They didn't have the funds to escape the war.
And also where to?
Okay, so you came from an area which had Western propaganda. In other words, you came from the States.
Yep.
You went over to Vietnam. You spoke to the locals. What is your takeaway?
Their attitude was, we can't change what has happened, and let's make the best of it. We've got to survive. We've got to work. and our families must be as safe as possible. And the best way to do that is to keep them almost underground and to feed them. There was no schooling at that time, so the children didn't go to school.
Do you think they were ignorant to the factors that actually led to the war and what motivated the war and why the war continued for so many years?
No, absolutely. Whether it was in denial, whether they didn't want to know, but they just knew there was unrest and war, and they had to get on with their own lives as best as possible. Thailand. And then that's where we went to Chiang Mai, because that had been one of our biggest things, Chiang Mai and the ruins there. We had heard about it a lot from people, and that era and how marvelous the tombs were and the temples were. We immediately got onto a moped and made our way to the ruins, and there was not one person there. And now Chiang Mai, there are crowds of people that go into there. They are the temples that are overgrown by the roots of trees. It's the most wonderful and exhilarating experience and humbling experience to be in, as these huge trees, their roots just hang over these beautiful temples. I'll tell you one thing which probably I will be in prison for, and that is I found the most beautiful piece of slate with an engraving on.
And you still have it at home?
Well, it was just asking to be picked up. Not particularly impressed with Bangkok. Very noisy, very dirty, so we didn't stay there very long, and we made our way to Kuala Lumpur, mainly to be able to catch a boat across to India from there. So we had taken a train all the way down. Kuala Lumpur was such a different take from Bangkok, which was dark, dirty, and Kuala Lumpur is sort of pristine, clean.
Both urban cities?
Yes. We heard of a boat that went across to India. They didn't allow Westerners or Europeans to sleep on the boat, on the deck, which is what we wanted to do, because that would obviously allow us to learn about the people there. So we went to the British Embassy and pleaded that we could go on the deck, and they said, no, you sleep in the only cabin there was on the boat, but you can then mingle with the people during the day, but you've got to eat and sleep in the cabin. The deck was full, absolutely. There wasn't space for another person to sit. There were births there, there were deaths there, and there was the occasion when the lifeboat was tested, which was quite a good idea, I thought, fantastic. But the fact that about half an hour later we saw it as a speck on the horizon and we realized it wasn't going to return, so we now had no way of being saved by the lifeboat.
So it was tested while you were out at sea as opposed to let's test it in the harbour? No,
it was out at sea. So where that is now, I don't know, on some beach somewhere else, but it never returned to us, which didn't make one particularly feel particularly safe. But anyway, it was fascinating to talk to these people. I hope they had a better life than on the deck of the boat.
Because the British Embassy said that you had to be down below deck in a cabin in the evenings and sleep in a cabin. Wasn't that for your security?
Yes, it was. Yes. But at that point in time, we were never afraid on any of our trips.
It's very much the same as going to some beautiful city or some beautiful country and staying in a 5-star hotel.
That's exactly.
You don't mingle with the locals.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, on all my travels, I don't think I ever ate in a hotel. I ate in the markets. And that's why, fortunately, I never had any problems with dysentery or anything like that.
Sorry, you say you ate in the markets. You never had deli belly.
No.
Your constitution just accepted and worked with whatever you ate.
Yeah. I didn't eat meat.
Okay.
That was one thing I didn't eat. So it was really just vegetables and dairy products like yogurts. When you're eating Western food in an Eastern country, then you get the deli belly because they don't really know how to cook it. I have actually once got it, and that was in Morocco when I ate salad.
But salad can also have salmonella.
Yeah, that's why I did. That's the first time and last time I ever had a problem with the Delhi belly.
With
Morocco belly.
Morocco belly. You keep on mentioning we. Who is this we? Is it the same troop of people that landed in New York and then went to California and went down to Mexico?
No, the wonderful thing about traveling is you can start off with people, with friends. And then as you go on, somebody wants to go in one direction, another in another, and then you may be on your own for a little while and you find another traveler and you're like-minded. So you continue with them. And then they might go in one direction and you in another, and you pick up somebody else. Or someone might say to you, you have to go to this place. And when you went there, you found somebody who was traveling back. So you weren't always with the same people.
Are you a social person?
No, I'm not a social person.
Because that's counter to what you're telling me.
It is.
An introvert, non-social person will generally shun away from other people communicating with them, even to the extent as if you're on a train and somebody wants to have a chat to you, you leave me alone. And you literally are putting your life in their hands as you travel.
But you forget one thing, and we have one thing in common, and that is travel, and with the same outlook on life, wanting to experience the country and the customs and talk to the people. So we had that in common. You would automatically be attracted by that person because of the common interest.
Have you still communicated with any of these people?
There was a Swedish lady I worked with on the Kibbutz. When I was looking to go to Gothenburg for the World Championships, for some reason her name came up on Facebook. And unfortunately, she lived too far away from Gothenburg, but otherwise we would certainly have met up.
Your parents, were they travelers?
My father was, because he was in the shipping business, so he traveled a lot. I do remember when I finished school that they thought that I should now experience what it was to travel. So they took me on one of these business travels, which was not my type of travel. And I realized that I'm never going to travel like that again.
Too structured,
and you had to be introduced to everybody.
The reason I ask you that is because I wonder, where does this lack of fear of travel and experiencing new things and new cultures come from?
I have a curiosity about people and traditions and philosophies, and that, traveling is the way to find out and learn tolerance and respect for other people. It's when you're exposed to people who have different theories, different ideas, different religions. You may not agree with them, but you respect them for what they believe in.
One of my cornerstones is knowledge and tolerance.
Yes.
I think that is pivotal in making your way through life.
Yes.
Because so often we judge other people, not because it's wrong, just because we don't understand it. So if we have the knowledge of why people do it, the knowledge of different traditions, and we can understand it, we don't necessarily have to follow those same traditions or even agree with them. But if we have the knowledge, we are more prone to tolerate.
I always say that my travels are the university of the world, because it taught me this, which universities doesn't appear in their curriculum, is the tolerance and respect.
Here in South Africa, a lot of us know about Club Mykonos. And some of us might even holidayed at Club Mykonos. But that couldn't be further from what you experienced living in a cave on the Mykonos island.
I would never even entertain the idea of Mykonos. Living in a cave, at that time of my travels, we didn't really have any money. So a hostel or a hotel was out of the question. And again, we heard from other travelers that there was this cave that was now vacant and available for us. We found the cave and we lived there. It was the most marvelous time. It was obviously quite damp and quite dark, but how often do you spend sleeping? And so we reckoned this was the best way to spend our time on Mykonos. But you must remember that that was just a place to have your backpack and sleep. The rest of the time was exploring the island.
That's the way I see an Ibis hotel.
Well, I'm glad you do, but try a cave next time.
No, I don't. Sleeping bags?
Yes.
Okay.
They're essential, except in South America. When I went to South America, it was a hammock, because what you did is if you arrived in a village or a town, you looked for somewhere that had a room with just 2 hooks on opposite walls. Mm-hmm. And then you put your hammock up there, and that's how you slept. So it was a sleeping bag for 2 years in South America.
This might sound ridiculous, but I think so many people can relate. Ablutions. If you're living in a cave, I'm going back to this point of caves. If you live in a cave, you have no ablutions.
Well, there's the sea. You can wash in the sea, and you can do all sorts of ablutions elsewhere. You find a public loo in the village or something like that. It didn't occur to us that it was a problem. I think probably because we probably had so few clothes with us that we learnt to live in those clothes. And I mean, nowadays people put on a shirt and then put it into the dirty linen basket in the evening. There we would wear a shirt for about 2 or 3 weeks.
Now whenever I travel, there's nothing that I treasure more than public toilets. It sounds ridiculous. But when you're traveling, especially if you're traveling through Europe, generally there aren't that many public facilities. It's not like here in South Africa where chances are every service station will have some kind of public facility.
Yes.
If you travel throughout Europe, many of them don't. And the chances are you are forced into the situation where if you need to use a restaurant's public facility, you need to pay them, which in a way defeats the object, because you're going to go and buy a coffee or you're going to go and buy a cold drink or whatever the case is. And that means within 60 minutes, you're going to need another facility somewhere.
I can't remember which trip it was. It was in Europe, and we couldn't find a hotel or a hostel, actually, it was then. So we went to the police station, and they gave us a cell, and they gave us breakfast the next day. And that became our way of finding accommodation if we were hard up, is to go to the local police stations and use their cells.
And they were accommodating.
Absolutely. Well, and giving us breakfast.
Times have changed.
Haven't they?
Indian man bus trip.
Yes.
And when you sent this to me in your bio, you put it in inverted commas. Indian man bus trip. What is it?
Well, it was a rickety old bus. It wasn't the first bus to go across from India to England, but it was the first one that was sort of made public. I must confess, having seen it at Delhi station, I wondered how sensible I was to get on it. It had sort of open windows, and it did have 4 wheels, which was quite good. And it needed a lot of attention on the way across to London. So we stopped quite often while it was repaired. We would get out and just wander around. But it did take us to some wonderful places. So we travelled all the way across. We went to Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, and then back through Europe. And it took 6 months.
The same bus?
The same bus.
And this is from India?
Yeah.
So you were travelling effectively from almost the southern part of the continent.
Yes.
You didn't travel diagonally left. You travelled up.
Yep, we did. It was really for the people who wanted to explore the countries around, which it did for us. We actually only arrived in Victoria Station with half of us, because people had dysentery and they fell by the way and they couldn't take it. And the next time I did it, I decided not to go in a bus. I decided to go in a combi. So I did the opposite way round. And that was quite a bit later. I was at a party somewhere and I heard someone say, I'm looking for someone to go to India. Do you know of anyone? So I put up my hand and said, I'm willing to go. So we had a combi, and then we went the opposite way, Victoria Station to India.
Same route?
No, we didn't. We took a more northern route, and that time it included Afghanistan. In fact, we were told, avoid the Kurds in Afghanistan. They're dangerous, they'll steal from you. And the first thing I did when I got to Kabul was to meet a German guy who had organized to actually ride in the mountains with a tribe of Kurds. And he said to me, do you want to come? So I bought myself an Afghan horse.
Had you been horse riding before? Were you experienced?
I was, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, basic stuff, but sort of English up and down, the royal riding. And the most beautiful saddles and all that kit for $10. And I joined this group of Kurds and the German. They were returning from Kabul to their villages because they'd got their wares and sold them in Kabul and now were taking food back to the villages. But they would only ride at night. I think there were too many Kurdish tribes that they were a bit apprehensive about. So we rode at night along very, very narrow paths and very high up. And I looked down and I thought, no, I'm not. I hope the horse knows what he's going to do. And then when we stopped during the day, I would have to camp further away from them. I wasn't allowed to camp with them, being a woman. And the German guy I was traveling with would bring me food from them. And I would have my own tent and I had to eat on my own.
Effectively, you're traveling through deserts and mountains.
Mountains.
Just mountains?
Just mountains.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's nothing like city or street lights? There's only perhaps the moon that sheds light on where you're going?
Absolutely.
Otherwise, it's pitch dark.
Yeah, but it's beautiful with the full moon. I mean, the mountain ranges were absolutely amazing. But, I had to be behind quite a lot. So I did wonder once or twice if the horse slipped at all, whether anyone would notice. I was right down at the bottom somewhere.
How long did that trip take?
That was about 10 days.
Did you ever fear for your life?
No. I do believe it's like putting up walls around houses and things like that. If you try and hide behind something, it actually attracts people. And I think if you give out a feeling that you're friendly, you're not a threat, that it helps tremendously. My husband and I had a house in Orchards, and it was the only house that had a broken down fence and no security. We were the only house that didn't get burgled. And I think that's my approach. If you don't threaten anyone, or if you show that you are quite transparent about life, people warm to that sort of thing.
Throughout these trips, did you feel you had blind faith? Blind faith, in other words, you don't know what lies ahead. You don't necessarily do all of the research. In those days, Google didn't exist.
No, you didn't.
But you had faith that you were going to make it through.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. With obstacles, obviously. But it was quite good to have obstacles, because when you faced them and overcame them, there was a feeling that you've...
A sense of achievement.
A sense of achievement, yep.